Good afternoon, welcome to Rough Cut Film Review. This is my James Bond special. So after I did the Skyfall review, a friend of mine suggested I actually do a Bond special. So off the back of that brief conversation, I've gone through and I've watched all of the Bond films chronologically, except for Skyfall, which obviously is the latest one. I wasn't aware either actually that Never Say Never Again was actually a bit different. There's something a bit dodgy going on there, and I was really amused to see Sean Connery brought back for that. But anyway, I'll go into that later. It's important to say, so I've seen the films. It's important to say I've not read any of the books, and that's a blessing. I'm sure Ian Fleming is not the world's greatest writer. And I've stayed away from internet critiques or other people's opinions. So this is, adult Chris sitting down and just sort of as cold as possible watching all of the James Bond films and having a bit of a think about it. So here we go. So I'm going to talk you through, the Bonds in a semi-structured manner, I suppose is probably best to describe it. And this is easily the most notes I've ever made to make one of these reviews. I actually did one of the first things I ever did for Rough Cut was 2011, sort of a year in summary, the best and worst of. But I made it over the 10 minutes that YouTube allow, when I didn't have the wherewithal to split it in two so I could actually put it up. So I've got a lot of material here, so fingers crossed this is going to make some kind of sense. It's become something of a dissertation really, so notes wise had about 5,000 words, so it's easily the most comprehensive thing I've done for Rough Cut, and hopefully the hard work is actually worth something. So I suppose the interesting thing to note when I was a kid was, without a doubt, Sean Connery was my favourite Bond. And I would imagine for most Bond purists, he remains the choice, However, I do actually find his representation, watching it again, of Bond deeply troubling, actually. He's pretty much basically a handsome man who is tasked with using very beautiful women, their weak human emotions. He's basically using their emotions against them to their inevitable detriment. And he's got this real casual indifference to mentally and physically hurting women that, generally love him. So from the Connery days, that's probably the thing that bothers me the most. It's probably the best example of it is from Russia with Love. He's got this woman on the train who's a Russian agent. She's defecting because she loves him. He's obviously promised her the earth and they're going to get married and do all these things and have kids and everything like this. And then later on he suspects that she's betrayed him, so he just sort of knocks her around. She tells him she loves him, and he sort of just beats her up. And and it turns out actually she was innocent and had no part in the plot. So he just sort of casually, without really thinking about it, is pretty horrible. And I suppose it's probably a tad unfair to judge a film for its sexual politics 50 years on. But it is very interesting to see how the Bond films have at least attempted to ape the times, and they're very much a product of their times and the context they sort of come from. After Connery, we had George Lazenby coming in, and he was aimed to be, as far as I can tell, more of the same. And despite him, he wasn't actually an actor. He hadn't acted in anything. He lied. And he only appeared in the one Bond film. He actually probably gets one of the best Bond plots. And Bond demonstrates for the first time, and it's actually pretty rare, he demonstrates emotional development and the ability to actually love other people. So in that film, Bond actually goes through some change, and that's incredibly rare for these films. Obviously, it all ends in tragedy, both for Bond and for Lazenby's career. But it was a good plot, and for that reason, it's one of the more interesting Bonds, and it's probably all the more interesting for all the reasons it failed. I did read that Lazenby was a male model, not an actual actor, and there was sort of this talented Mr. Ripley thing going on where he started sort of stalking Sean Connery in real life, going to the same tailor as him, and getting up to all these sort of shenanigans to land the role. So he lied and said he'd acted in Czechoslovakia and all these places which he knew that they wouldn't be able to trace him. And some of his key scenes were overdubbed by a different actor because he was pretty poor. Apparently he was extremely hard to work with, to the point where the director refused to talk to him. What's really interesting actually is Connery's Bond has a really dark sense of humour, and you get this real foreboding that probably he will be killed at any given time. He does actually take pleasure from the women he sleeps with and killing as well, actually, to some extent, even though he does very little of that in the first few films, like Dr. No, for example. Whereas Lazenby's Bond has sex with loads of women in this one film, but we never see him actually seem to derive any pleasure from it. It's more sort of compulsive for Lazenby's Bond. How much of that is deliberate and how much is just down to Lazenby's inexperience and lousy acting, it's difficult to ascertain, really. However, Lazenby gets what I deem to be Bond's most significant event, where Bond gets married, and actually he does love the woman. Their relationship's very traditional. It's an arranged marriage with the deal between Bond and the father. There's something of the tale of the shrew in there, in that the wife is actually intelligent and has a will of her own, and actually has something a bit about her, which was very rare for Bond girls at that time. So it really was a step up for the vast majority of Connery's Bond girls. Most of them were beautiful but vulnerable and sort of quite simpering. So all they really wanted to do was feel Bond's big hard muscles, pretty much. Whereas she actually had a bit more about her. So after Lazenby, they then brought back Sean Connery to actually save the franchise. And then after that, we had Roger Moore coming in. And when I think back to Moore's films, I think of them as, cheesy, camp, lots of quips. And that's actually true to a large extent. But I mean, one of the main things about Moore is the diminishment of that sort of sense of peril you had in Sean Connery's days. You never really think that Roger Moore is going to just get shot going into a room and die. You think, he'll be all right in the end. But I've got to say, I mean, watching all of these Sean Connery films, I found it really tough going, and watching The Man with the Golden Gun, one of Moore's first ones, was a real palliative. It was, like when you have a massive Indian meal and you're feeling sort of bloated and oh gosh, and then you have that lemon water. It's refreshing, and it's you can. And one of the refreshing aspects, obviously, it's a lot more sort of quippy and zippy. But, I've never said that before. But also, in terms of stunts, you can see, the stunts get all the more impressive in the Roger Moore times. And you can actually see why, stuntmen have been killed working on Bond films. Even today, it's pretty jaw-dropping stuff. And I think Roger Moore was a really interesting choice for Bond, and he represented a real sea change. And just an attempt to bring everything up to date to the 1970s. So you can tell from the hints of funk in the soundtrack, the cut of Bond's shirts, his suits, are clearly an attempt just to update things and refresh things and try and make them relevant for the time, as we've seen more recently as well. So, for example, The Spy Who Loved Me, there's an attempt to rebalance the sexual politics. We've got this attractive KGB agent. She seems to have a mind of her own. She does stuff that she wouldn't be allowed to do in films prior to that. We've got the introduction of Jaws, and they just try and move things along. And in The Spy That Loves Me, there's actually a really nice scene where Bond and the hottie are just travelling through the Egyptian desert. We get a few bars of the wonderful score from Lawrence of Arabia. It's just sort of a little bit more playful than it had been previously. But it's fair to say in the later Connery films, they did try and introduce a little bit of humour, but it tended to be black and, a little bit on the line there. So, there was a bit of slapstick in that, we had the bumpkin sheriff, I think it was called J.W., and, wherever he went, he saw Bond, and, Bond was sinking his boat, and, he was, and girl, I'll get ye, all that sort of stuff. And then I think at the end he was, he had a cameo. He went to Vietnam, or he went on holiday in Asia, and then he sees Bond in a boat, and he goes, oh, blimey, and then he meets Bond. So there was an attempt, but it was pretty feeble, really.